Hey, and welcome to Be the Bridge. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner. From the time I was 11, I tried to pray away the gay. But my senior year in college, I realized I could pray and be gay. Each week, I'll share my experiences and chat with others as we build a bridge between the LGBT community and people of faith. Thanks for joining, and let the construction begin. Hello, fellow bridge builders. Thank you all for joining me today for this 26th episode of Be the Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner, author of the novel, The Wisdom of Stones. The novel's about Ben, a college senior, who promised God and his Mima he'd be a Southern Baptist preacher, but he can't pray away the gay. The novel's loosely based on my own attempts to reconcile being attracted to guys with my Southern Baptist upbringing. But this struggle between sexuality and faith, it's all too common for so many in our LGBTQIA+ community. After hearing similar stories, I decided to launch this podcast called Be the Bridge. My purpose is to help people in the LGBTQIA+ community reconnect with their faith. And I hope to help people of faith learn the importance of being more inclusive and allowing everyone to know the fullness of the love of God. Although my prior guests have been from a conservative Christian background, often similar to mine, I've always wanted to include people of diverse faith backgrounds. My guest today is someone who grew up in an Islamic faith, and she has struggled to reconcile that with her sexuality. Mais Al-Nima, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Mais, my first question is one I ask all my guests, because growing up from the South is sort of what we asked anybody that we met for the first time. Where are you from? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Iraq, Baghdad, and I grew up there for most of my childhood. Out of there when I was around 11 or 12. That was right when the war erupted, and my family and I had to flee the country. That was end of 2004. So I moved out to Syria at that time, and I lived there for about 4 to 5 years. So my early teenagehood was in Syria from roughly 12 years old to 16 years old. And then from there, I moved to Kuwait, spent my last year of high school there, and then spent my years of college there too.
How many people are in your family? How many brothers and sisters do you have?
So I have one brother and one sister. I'm the oldest. There's a 4 years gap between each of us.
Okay.
I don't know how that worked out, but it's perfect.
And then do they live in Kuwait still, or have they all moved to the United States?
We all moved to the United States.
And tell me a little bit about that. How old were you when you all moved?
So I was 22. My sister was 18, just transitioning to college, and my brother was in high school. First year of high school, actually.
So you grew up in predominantly Muslim countries. Were you raised very religious, or was your religion more of a cultural thing? Like in the South, so much of our religion is just cultural because everybody goes to church. But for many of us, like...
I have a very interesting dynamic there because I went through like different stages depending on like my train of thought, you can say, at that time. So when I was in Iraq, my family was basically culturally Muslim. My mom was more practicing. I could describe my dad as agnostic. So he didn't really focus a lot on religion in his life. But I think when we moved to Syria, it kind of a shift happened where I became more interested in Islam and Islamic tradition. So I started going more to the mosques, engaging with the Quran more, reading more about what it means to be Muslim. And I joined a group that was more about, studying the Quran and trying to dissect it and understand it.
Was there a particular triggering event that happened in Syria?
Honestly, it was not what happened in Syria per se, more what happened before Syria. I think living through the war for a couple of years was really traumatizing for me as a child. And so when I moved to Syria and I needed this sense of belonging, sense of community, and I'm pretty sure you can relate to that, to Christianity. Right. Similarly, in Islam, it's a lot of the religion is about creating community and feeling that sense of belonging.
Right.
So I really wanted to feel that, and I wanted to fit in as a teenager in a new culture, So that was my way to integrate not just religiously, but also culturally into the Syrian environment and feel like I'm a part of a bigger something.
Can you tell me a little bit about the services and things that you went to there when you were in Syria?
So mainly the way I started, it was by going to the Eid prayer. And it happens like after Ramadan. So we would fast for 30 days. When we break our fast, the first day, there's a huge prayer early in the morning, right after dawn. So that was a big thing for me. I went almost every year when I was in Syria there. But also there was this weekly thing where I would go with a bunch of people, mainly with my female friends, and we'd have some sort of a lesson, you can say, where we discuss the Quran and go about different interpretations of it and how we understand different concepts in Islamic tradition and in Islamic interpretations. Because as you know, there are a lot of interpretations of the Quran and Hadith, and there are so many different traditions. Of course, I used to practice religiously. I would pray 5 times a day, do my fasting every year. So I was like very committed at that point in my life.
Do you remember any of the messages in particular? Anything really resonate with you when you were a teenager there in Syria that you just sort of remember to this day?
Yeah, I would say it's probably the way that I felt God's presence or Allah's presence. When you pray, you're talking directly to Him, and you're feeling that connection. And that is something that I still think about till this day. Yeah, how to connect and maintain that relationship.
It's funny because in the Southern Baptist tradition, that was one thing that was critical to our particular denomination, was that you could talk directly with God, Allah, the divine, whatever we want to call him or her. and
or her,
that,
exactly.
Yeah. And that was a relationship that each individual had the right for himself or herself to speak directly and to hear and listen and to believe what you are called by the Spirit to believe.
Exactly. If I got out of like those 4 years with anything, it would be that thing, that you have a connection to this universe, to this superpower outside, or like you said, whatever you want to call it, there is that direct connection.
Did you get many lessons there in Syria about the role of men and women in the church?
Oh, yeah. That is probably what pains me most in that period, is the very rigid gender roles and how we talk about it in context of Islam or in context of religion in general. It's very set. It's very traditional. It saddens me so much that there's a lot of emphasis in a lot of interpretations on the traditional role of a woman in, like, giving birth and maintaining the kind and staying at the home and nurturing the family. And the man is more of like the decision maker, the breadwinner. At that time, I was a very young feminist. There was a huge dissonance in my brain about that. Wow. As I grew up, that was one of the main reasons I was starting to look into newer interpretations of the Quran and newer interpretations of the tradition.
Let me go back to this statement that you said, is you were a 12-year-old feminist.
Yes.
How did you come to having those views? Was that something you got from a relative, or was there a leader in that particular community how did you feel that way? Or did you just sort of have that internally without sort of an external influence?
That's an interesting question, because I think my feminist identity is something that I don't necessarily reflect as much as my queer identity. So kind of, you're making me think about it right now. Well, when I grew up, I was very self-dependent. I valued my space a lot and my views and my opinions. So I was always outspoken about what I thought, and I was a lot perceived as too much of a tomboy,
Okay.
or too much like, yeah, that was something that was said to me a lot, even when I was like 7 or 8 years old. I'm like, they are like, you're too loud for a girl,
Wow, yeah.
And I'm like, so that I think was like a root of it, of like, why can't I say my opinion and be outspoken and be a girl? Like, why does these two things have to contradict? As I grew up, I had a lot of female role models in my life. Since I moved a lot, there was a lot of family, you can call us kind of nomadic,
right?
Because like my dad had to stay in Iraq for a while and work while we while we were in Syria. So my mom was always my role model, and I saw her how she went about consolidating, being in a new environment and working and raising us and providing for us. So she was everything in the house. My mom was like such a huge role model in my life, even unconsciously. And now only when I think about it, I can reflect. Also, that added to my independence of like feeling a responsibility as the oldest daughter to help her and be an anchor for her in a new place. So that kind of just added fuel to all of those layers that I already had in my way of thinking. And then I was like, you know what? If you're a guy and you think that I can't be loud just for being a woman, I'm going to just be louder.
When you grew up, were there specific gender norms for how boys dressed and how girls dressed? And was that something that you fought against?
Oh, yeah, all the time. That is something that I had to deal with, even like when I was around 8 or 9. And my mother still laughs about it sometimes because till now, she's like, I used to fight so much with you trying to have you put on dresses. Even when I was as young as that age, I did not want to wear dresses. I did not want to have my hair done a specific way or be quote unquote dressed up, you know? I'm like, yeah, just get me a pants and jeans and let me run, you know? Now that I'm okay with my gender identity, with my queer identity, I don't mind doing that occasionally. I just have to do it on my terms when I feel comfortable with it, not when society tells me, oh, this is the appropriate way for you to dress or behave even.
When we talked before, you had mentioned that you identify not as much as lesbian, but as gay and then probably more so queer. So I'm just curious about what's your evolution on terminology and why don't you connect with the word lesbian as much?
With the terminology, it gets a bit confusing, I think. We go through this long process of coming out, even to ourselves. So I remember when I first felt an attraction towards a woman, I was like, wait, what is happening? Am I bisexual?
Wow.
And you kind of try to rationalize because the term lesbian itself I feel it's so stigmatized, right? Or even the term gay there is a lot of stigma that comes with being attracted only to the same sex. So I personally tried to distance myself from that when I first started thinking about my queerness, just because I didn't want to necessarily associate it to myself. So I kind of steered away from that. But then as you come to accept it more, you're like, you know what? I had a stage where I was like, I'm a lesbian. It's just that. I'm attracted to girls. That's just a fact. I love the term queerness. I love that we're using it so much because I feel like our generation is deviating from those binaries, those like, you know, you have to be either or. Like you're either attracted to this gender or that gender. You're either a male or a female. And I love how we're challenging those binaries in everyday life.
That's so great because when I first came out, gay men would say, well, I'm a straight acting gay man. Mm-hmm. Which, looking back on that, oh my God, that is incredibly offensive on so many levels. I think it's very exciting that y'all are pushing the boundaries on gender as a social construct. Do we even need it?
This is something I feel a lot about very strongly. So I study sociology and I focus on women and gender studies. And that is something I talk about on a daily basis. So I'm very passionate about how we create gender and how we come about to understand it and associate with it or not associate with it and why. And one of the main things that really struck with me throughout is how gender is basically a performance. Going back to what you just said about straight acting, right? So this is a performance, basically. And you can take that concept and mainly run away with it in every single aspect of your life because you have a certain image that you want to reach. Society tells you masculinity is coded this way and femininity is coded this way. So there are almost these rules that you have to play by, and we want to adhere to them so we appear normal. Because there are gender sanctions on that. If we don't associate with those norms, then there might be punishments. We get gender policed. So we have almost, it's a form of survival that we have to perform, right? If we don't perform, then we're going to get punished for it. Call me an optimist, and maybe this is a part of like me being in a university setting, you know?
Right,
but
right.
I think young people are more aware to these gender dynamics, and I see us kind of deviating from that. I mean, just look at how recent it is, the use of pronoun when we introduce ourselves. This has been like, 2-3 years now that people, when they introduce themselves, use their pronouns too. And I think this is not something to take for granted. I think it's a huge leap that we start using pronouns, even when someone who might present themselves as more feminine, they might identify as they, and just the shock of that and having that be normalized now more, I think is a huge thing.
Right, right. So I mentioned a little bit at the beginning of my introduction about the struggle I had with my sexuality and faith. And it was something that started when I was very, very young, because our pastor would always talk about homosexuals and talk about how they're condemned to hell. And it was something I really grew up with. And I probably hit the wall at about 22, and I just gave up on the church. I didn't feel that there was any place for me there. And I left the church for a long time, only recently having discovered the Gay Christian Network, the Q Christian Fellowship, and seeing how other people have reconnected with their faith. It really brought me a lot of hope. And in the last 2 years, I've reconnected with my faith tradition. Where are you in your spiritual journey with Islam?
This is actually a really awesome question. So thank you for asking that. For me, I identify with so much of what you said about, this being a more recent discovery or a more recent tranquility that I've been feeling recently. I'm finally at peace with being both Muslim and queer. And it took so long of kind of this identification process of I'm this, but I'm not that. When I first started realizing that I was queer and I was attracted to women, I negated that completely. I pushed it down. And when I was finally done with myself, I couldn't deny it anymore. It was just so much present in my life at one point where it was painful to not think about it. So when that resurfaced, I found myself negating my religious identity or my faith identity. I'm like, okay, now I'm queer, so I can't be Muslim.
Huh. Let me ask you a question on that. Did you have the language to think of it as a queer identity, or was it just, I find this girl attractive, I know that's bad and that's evil or a sin or whatever it would be in Islam?
That's an awesome question. Yeah, I think it was more of not having the language. I didn't know what it was called. I think I was too young, and I didn't know enough about the subject at the time. But I just knew that it was wrong. I felt like it was wrong. I'm like, oh my God, I'm attracted to women, and what is wrong with me?
So after you had this first realization that you were attracted to another girl, and it said it was something you pushed down, did you ever talk to an adult or a friend or anyone about these attractions, or did you just keep this as a deep, dark secret?
Oh no, I did not talk to anyone about it. It was just between me and myself, and even that I tried to limit the amount of time I was thinking about it. I was consciously trying to fight it.
When was the first time that you talked to someone and said, hey, I'm having these attractions?
Oh, that was a while afterwards, because I'm the kind of person who cannot, I can't share externally if I'm not kind of okay with it internally. That was probably in Kuwait when I was around 19, maybe, that I actually talked to my sister about it. So it took me a long while to even say, oh, I'm attracted to women out loud to someone else. It took me a long time.
And you said your sister would have been 15 at the time?
Yes.
Tell me about that conversation. How did you bring that up, and what was her response?
So around that time, I had this huge crush on a woman in my life. I was just reaching a point where it was almost impossible not to share that crush. When you have those intense feelings,
right.
Oh my God, I need to talk to someone about this. Sort of, this is how I brought it to my sister. I was like, this person, and she kind of nods knowingly, which was like amazing for a 15-year-old, right? Eyes me with a knowing smile, and she goes like, uh-huh. And I'm like, I think I'm like attracted to her. And she goes like, okay. And I kind of emphasize it and go like, like physically attracted to her. And she's kind of like, okay. Wow. And like, she's waiting for something more, right?
Wow.
And I was just at that point, just like kind of baffled at her reaction, or mostly, honestly, non-reaction, right? Of like, yeah, and what did you do about it?
Right.
How are you proceeding?
Right. Like, you thought that was the punchline of the story, and she's like, okay, yeah, like, where's the story going? Because I'm not getting it yet. So.
Exactly. And the whole point for me was like, this is the punchline. Like, I'm attracted to a woman. Right. So that was such a significant moment for me, I think, of this is my sister who I love and hold dearly so much. She was completely not just okay with it, she was encouraging me to do something about it.
And so what happened?
There was something that was almost going to happen, and then it didn't. I kind of came out about my feelings, and it wasn't about her not being okay with it. It was more about she had to leave the country. Yeah. but actually went better than I thought. Yeah, it went when it came to like actually acknowledging feelings or like feeling stigmatized. Because my biggest fear was like, what if I tell this girl and she thinks I'm disgusting, right? And she thinks that this is just an unacceptable behavior, and I would lose even her friendship. And it was not anything of that sort. It was actually way more positive than I thought. And I came out of it with a knowledge that I need to be more acceptant of who I am and not be scared of my own feelings.
Right. So at that point, had you put a label on anything yet? Or were you just attracted to girls? Did you consider yourself lesbian, queer?
I didn't put a label on it, but I was, at that point in my life, I was very aware of the dynamics and the terminology. By 19, I would have done a lot of like research on it, because apparently that's what you do. So I did a lot of research on like identity politics, gay and lesbian mostly. And I kind of started hunting down media outlets. I don't know, it was at that time, I think, was like kind of Grey's Anatomy was kind of breaking the boundaries in sexual orientation. And, so I would like hunt down activists or actors who talk about it, or, TV shows and watch movies about it. But I didn't put myself in a box at that point. I was just like, okay, I'm attracted to women now, and I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure if it should mean anything.
Did your parents ever find out during this time period that you were attracted to other girls?
I don't think at that time they necessarily knew, but years later when I came out to them, I think they kind of knew all along that I was attracted to women my entire life. I just don't know if they had acknowledged it at that point in their lives.
Right. It's like all the puzzle pieces are there. They've been looking at them all along, and then just with a slight shift, all of a sudden you say, oh yeah, now everything makes sense.
Yes, exactly. It's like, oh, this is why she was always a tomboy. Oh, this is why all her crushes were like female celebrities. Oh, ding, 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 ding.
So how old were you when you told your parents?
This is actually not too long ago. 24 when I told my mom, 25 when I told my dad. And
how did they react?
It was amazing, actually, really? The reaction that I got. And wow. I can't believe that I have an amazing coming out story. Because there is a lot of, stigma and like coming from the culture like we talked about, and coming from kind of having lived in that environment.
Right.
But honestly, especially with my mom, I didn't want to disappoint her. And that was a feeling us as queer people, we have almost all the time when we come out to someone of like, especially your parents, like they have those visions for you in life. Oh, you're going to get married or have kids or whatever. And just by you coming out, you like instantly smash all of those expectations.
Right. I interviewed someone one time, and she was saying that the parents write all these stories for us, and her son was gay, and she said that she thought that all of this whole story she'd written for her son's life had to be smashed, but what she realized was that the script could be the same. You would just have to cast different characters.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great way to look at it. That's amazing. I don't think it's a stretch to say that my mom kind of reacted in a similar manner because she basically, what was the product of that conversation is that you're my daughter, and I'm going to always love you. And it doesn't matter that you live a slightly different life than what I envisioned for you. I just want you to be healthy and happy.
Right.
And if that means that there's a woman in your life instead of a man, then that's okay. And as long as you love the person you're with and you're happy, then that's what I care about. And that was a huge breaking point for me, like a huge breakout. Yeah.
Right. So did you ever have a conversation with Allah about your feelings and ask him to take them away, to change them? What was your conversation like with Allah through this whole journey?
Wow, that is a loaded question. So, well, especially in the beginning of it, I was like, is this a punishment?
Punishment for anything in particular or just general?
Yeah, I was like, are you testing me? Is this a special test that I have to pass for you to, reward me in the end or whatever? Is this another test of my humanity or another test of my worthiness, of my purity or cleanliness that I have to pass for you? And a lot of that was because I felt like it was me being dirty or me being inappropriate or me being like crossing that line, right, of the absolute forbidden. So are you like kind of tempting me for you to test me and I have to pass that for something good to happen or for me to feel good about myself? Because I was feeling guilty all the time. I was feeling ashamed all the time. I felt like you can't feel better until you overcome that, right?
Right.
And I was having a lot of conversations around that. I'm like, just make me feel better. Why can't I feel better about myself?
Right.
And then I think it shifted into like punishment. It's like, are you punishing me because I can't get over it? It's like, am I feeling this bad about myself? It's because I couldn't pass that test. Like you were testing me and I obviously failed because now you're punishing me by not only not being able to talk about myself and pursue, someone I liked, but also about feeling that all of that internal turmoil inside. And at that point, I couldn't have a conversations with anyone about it. So that was all like internal boiling down of self-hatred almost.
Right. That's a very common story that people go through because there's that conversation with the divine about changing me. And then when that doesn't happen, you sort of bargain and say, well, if you'll do this, I'll do that. And you feel like at some point, if God hasn't delivered you from this, then Allah has betrayed you.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the chink in the armor for me was, well, I've done everything I can and everything I can try to do. Why haven't you upheld your end of the bargain? That's really where my faith kind of went off the rails because I felt like God had abandoned me and betrayed me to give me these feelings, but telling me they were evil and I was a sinner and I was going to hell and I couldn't do anything to act on them. It was too much.
Yeah.
My faith was the sacrifice that enabled my survival.
Yeah, that is so true and so relatable because my next stage was exactly that. I was like, you know what? You're not doing anything about it. And I've absolutely reached my ends when it comes to trying to pray away the gay, right? Or trying to suppress. Like I reached the point where like I couldn't anymore. And I felt like I was giving so much without anything in return, kind of the same what you were saying. So that was when I was completely disconnected. I was like, okay, you're going to cut me off. Guess what? I'm cutting you off too.
Right.
All of the action and like all of that experience that I had in Syria, I was like, you know what? I'm done with it. I don't want to do it anymore. It doesn't matter. And I convinced myself that it doesn't matter to me and to who I am anymore. You're not with me. I'm not with you. Now I'm queer. you can't accept it, then it's fine. I'll just go my separate way and have religion not be a part of myself because it doesn't matter anymore.
So the big question, what changed for you? What brought you back where you realized that faith had value?
It's harder to pinpoint the experience or that moment specifically. I think a lot of it has that layer of feeling kind of estranged in a new environment too. I don't have a sense of like Arab community around or a Muslim community. And I was suddenly in this new environment where I have to be alone. So that might have been a part of it, of wanting to kind of reconnect to my cultural roots and not necessarily to the religious roots. So part of it was definitely that callback to Arab music and Arab culture, Arab poetry, literature. So I wanted to reconnect with my heritage. So definitely a part of being in the United States was a callback to that culture, and kind of religion comes and spirituality comes with that callback. But I think the most significant moment whenever I think about this question is the moment I came out to my mom. That moment when she was 100% supportive and 100% okay with it.
Wow.
I was like, oh my God, that means that my culture and my religion also can be okay with it. If my mom, the person, like we talked about, the person I uphold as a role model and as such a dominant figure in my life, if that person who represents everything that my culture is, everything that I perceive to be virtuous, is okay with my identity and my queerness, then maybe I should go back and see how Islam looks at me. And maybe there is hope in how my culture and how my religion would look at queer people. And that was the real nail for me of like, okay, I'm doing this right now and I'm going to try and be both. And I don't know how that would look like, but it's okay. I'll figure it out as I go. Yeah.
So do you ever think maybe this was a test from Allah with regards to testing your humanity and saying, look, I'm going to give you this and people may not understand it, but once you understand it, then let's get back together and figure out how together we can move forward and help other people.
Wow. Wow. I never thought about it that way. So kind of thank you for opening my eyes to this. Kind of going the full circle on the journey. I think it might be a valid interpretation, honestly, because with a lot of what I've been trying to do recently, kind of independently and in collaboration with people on campus and friends, and kind of just trying to have community around this topic, I think it's totally valid to interpret it as a way of how do you go from self-realization to getting this out to the world? Now that you have self-realized, how can you utilize that to help others who might be right now in your shoes?
So let me ask you a question I ask all guests. And I'd like to ask in terms of building a bridge maybe with people in other countries. I heard from a listener yesterday in South Africa, and they really got a lot out of the podcast by hearing people struggle with their faith and sexual orientation. What would you say to that 12-year-old girl in Syria or that 19-year-old girl in Kuwait that's in the same position you were those years back? What advice would you give him, her, they?
Wow. It's so hard to fight back what you've been taught. It's so hard to listen to your authentic voice and try and be yourself in a world that tells you that similarity is what matters, and in a world that tells you you have to conform and be like everyone else. And that struggle is not easy. It might not get easy as you go through it, but the reward is magnificent. It's a long road and it's a long journey, but I would say that unique voice that you have, you will learn to value it because it is what makes you unique and what makes you stand out. You are beautiful and you have an addition to this world. Wherever you are, by tapping into that inner voice, you can change people's lives, I believe.
What is one or two things that got you through that very difficult struggle?
The most thing that I relied on throughout the journey of even till the moment that I came out to my mom, which was very significant for me, it was my support system. It was my sister, and later on my brother, and then my aunt. So finding that even that small congregation of people, that small group of people who just get you, and you can share your inner thoughts with, because really just talking about it out loud to someone and processing through it was so vital for me. And that validation, that first validation that I got from my sister was huge, even in the way that I thought about myself, and kind of reflected it back on like to my journey of like self-acceptance and being okay with it. Another thing that was more of an internal factor to it is that ability to self-reflect. And it might not necessarily always be a positive thing, because sometimes you end up beating up yourself over ridiculous things sometimes.
Yeah, we've all been there too often, I think. So.
Yeah. Trying to critically look at yourself and how you act, even after you've done the action itself, it is such a window to your inner voice. It is such a critical way for you to tap into your subconscious and to tap into your brain and those hidden valleys in your heart. Kind of just listen to that authentic voice, or like your intuition, and kind of let that lead you almost in how you further think about yourself and further explore yourself. Because your entire life is a journey. What's the point of it if you can't listen to your desires?
So, Mais, I've probably asked you some of the toughest questions I've asked any guest. So let me just double down on that and ask you what I think is probably the most challenging question I've asked anyone. I'll start with the easy one. What is your faith like today? And where do you hope it will be in 5 years?
Interesting. So as of right now, I kind of hinted on that before. For me, is rediscovering Islam or queering Islam. I don't even know if I want it to even have a label of Islam on it, but I know that I borrow a lot from Islamic tradition in the way I go about my life. So sometimes I feel it's not fair not to mention Islam. But I feel like I'm in the way of exploring a sort of a new spirituality and a new way to be in the world while you're spiritual and queer at the same time. So what does a queer faith look like? And what does that mean in terms of practice or in terms of spirituality? That's where I'm at right now. In 5 years, I honestly have no idea. There is a lot of pull and push, even back in our Arab countries, about what it means like to what would Islam look like re-envisioned, right? Even that is ambiguous. So even pulling on that furthermore and trying to queer Islam, I have no idea what that would look like. But I would want to believe that it would be an all-inclusive, open community to everyone.
So, Mais, what a wonderful conversation we've had today. I so appreciate your being on the show today.
Thank you so much.
If folks want to learn more about you and maybe have their own exploration of faith and what it would look like to queer their faith, any resources you might suggest that they look to?
Yeah, so currently in Denver, I'm involved in a few organizations on campus. On the CU Denver campus, my friend Jazz is a founder of You Are Welcome Here, and it's a conference that revolves around the conversation of faith and queer identity. So I would definitely encourage people to try and reach out to us. The conference is going to be in October, but we're on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and it's You Are Welcome Here, YAWH. That's like the abbreviation of it. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram to know more about it. I'm also currently involved with Ibrahim, who's another Muslim queer on my campus, constructing a group for queer Muslims, especially, or people from the Middle East and queer. We're still in the initial stages of trying to launch the group. We're calling it Salam. So it's an all-inclusive group of whether you were queer or questioning or just, want to learn more about the conversation and what that would look like, whether you were an ally or it doesn't matter who you are as much as it matters that you want this inclusive environment and you want to be a part of this community. I think building communities is the most important piece to what Ibrahim and I are trying to do. So feel free to reach me at my email. It's Mais, MAIS .Al-Nima, ALNIMA, @gmail.com. If you have any questions, if you need resources or just want to have a conversation around these topics, I'm more than happy to connect.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I will have the specific details of all that in the show notes. If people go to my website, brianpaytonjoyner.com/podcast, they can see the specific write-up on that. Again, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to coming there to Denver and meeting all of you guys one day.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. We would love to meet and connect and have all the conversations about queerness and gender.
Yes. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Be the Bridge. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love a positive rating and review on iTunes. I appreciate your support and feedback. For more details, visit brianpaytonjoyner.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter. The links are in the show notes. Have a great week. And as my grandpa used to say, if you live life by your own rules, you're gonna be okay.